Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 14th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's dive straight into it. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Laura J. Martin. She's a professor of environmental studies at Williams College and a past fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. She's written for several popular outlets like the Washington Post, Time Magazine, the LA Times, and Scientific American, and she has a new book out. It's called Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Laura J. Martin. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm excited to talk about your newest book, Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration. It's now in paperback. The book's been out for a little bit. Have there been changes between the original and the paperback form?
No, the paperback is a lighter, more portable form of the original book. There certainly have been some changes to what's going on with ecological restoration since the book, the hardback came out in 2022. And here we are talking in 2025. So there's certainly big changes that have happened, both with what's happening with restoration globally and also, of course, at the US federal level and what that looks like. But readers have a choice between a hard version and a soft version.
Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about you before we get into the work. I mean, let's talk about your work before we get into the specific work of the book. So you are both a historian and an ecologist. You trained in both areas, which uniquely positions you to talk about certain topics. Tell me a little bit about your academic path and how you sort of combined those two areas of interest.
Yeah, it's a pretty unusual pathway. I started my career as a evolutionary ecologist. I went into academia thinking that I wanted to do, basic science, and I was in a lab that was looking at wetland plant communities and how invasive species impact plants. But as I was training, I was in an interdisciplinary environmental studies program. So I was being exposed to people in the social sciences, people in the humanities, thinking about how people shape nature. And that was something that was my driving interest in science. I wanted to understand how human actions were shaping nature. And so it was a kind of winding reckoning with, I guess, what my true methodological passions are. I spent a number of years doing both field work in wetlands ecology as well as archival work, thinking about the history of ecology, the history of environmental regulation, and I've had the amazing opportunity to get to kind of blend both in my current position as an environmental studies professor and in my current work. And I think that although it's pretty unusual in academia for people to bridge the sciences and the humanities, there's a lot of infighting between those two groups. I think that evolutionary ecologists are already historical thinkers and that environmental historians are already ecological thinkers. And so there's actually a lot of interesting overlap between those two fields.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm curious too, because I shouldn't say you're not just an ecologist and a historian, just as if that's not enough. But you also are a public communicator of this science. I mean, looking back, you've been writing not just peer-reviewed journal articles, but trade essays, articles in consumer magazines for quite some time. So when did you decide, or when did you start trying to get those messages out there in a more public way and sort of getting outside of the walls of academia?
From when I entered academia, I'd say I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I was a first generation college student. I came from a community where nobody had connections to academia, and it was really important to me as I was training up in the ivory tower that I communicate what I was thinking about and what I was learning about to a broader audience, and to kind of write things that my friends and my family from home would be interested in. And so I think I always wanted that. It was always an important kind of driving motivation for the academic research that I was doing, that it be something that was important to society, and something that I was communicating. And I think that I got maybe a little frustrated. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, as someone in science communication. I think I got frustrated when I was in graduate school at the idea that there are these two very separate I, communities of people. There's people that are doing research and creating knowledge, and then there's people who can translate that knowledge. And I think I was frustrated that the the social scientists in the room and the humanists in the room were kind of being described by the scientists as like, oh, you can take my complex ideas and simplify them, simplify
Right.
them.
Yeah.
And I've found, communicating to a public audience is really hard, and it's not. I haven't found it to be a practice of simplification. I think there's a lot of nuance that goes into it, and it the question of how to take really complicated, involved topics like ecological restoration, and to be able to kind of talk about them and write about them in a way that is interesting to people. It's Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this topic too.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because I think a lot of times, we hear language that is like so infuriating, like just dumb it down, and it's like, well, that's not what we're doing. Like, and I love that you made that sort of distinction. We're trying to make it interesting, and I think the simplification part, it's a language thing, right? It's not about simplifying a concept; it's about simplifying the jargon. Like, if you're not trained in a specific field, you don't know the lexicon, and instead of teaching everybody all the words so they can just read the articles themselves, it's about, quote, when we say translating it for the public, which is like, I think, kind of pejorative, what we're really saying is speak about it without a lot of jargon. Like, explain when your toilet breaks, like how you fix it without using all the terminology that a plumber knows. Like, that's all it is.
Right. And don't take for granted that the person that you're speaking to is as, you know, deep in the jargon as you are.
Yeah. That was a tough, kind of day for me. One of my first days in a public science communication job that was like very corporate. Like, I remember working at the Huffington Post a million years ago when we first launched a science page, and my editor being like, I was like writing a piece, and I was like, and so the DNA, blah, 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 and he was like, you can't say DNA. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, people don't know what DNA is. And I was like, people don't know what DNA is. I'm like, oh God. But it's true. Like there, and know your audience, right? It's okay. Like, this show, part of why I love doing Talk Nerdy and have been doing it for over 10 years is because this audience is an audience that is, what I always say, is scientifically enthusiastic, but not necessarily trained in the individual fields of science that we talk about. So I do not underestimate the intelligence of this audience, and I want to have sophisticated and nuanced conversations on the show. And I try to be mindful of, if we use words that we don't know what those words mean, oh, wait, what does that word mean? But beyond that, this is not a podcast for people who aren't interested in these topics.
And I had, I think, maybe a similar rude awakening when I started writing essays, right? Because I started for a scientifically interested and scientifically educated audience, writing for Scientific American and venues like that, where I could presume, so where you can say DNA, right? And so
Right,
then
right.
broadening out to more kind of mass market things recently, I have been. I've also been had to learn, like, hearing back from editors saying, you can't.
Hmm.
This doesn't make sense to me as an
Hmm.
editor. And to be like, oh, okay, I was taking for granted a familiarity with the subject.
Which makes sense when you're steeped in it all day, every day, right? And that is part of what we talk about when we talk about the quote ivory tower. It's sometimes not so nefarious and intentional as I want to stay separate. It's that you're so steeped in the language and the literature for so long that you forget, or that it just is, it's normative to you. And so that is, I think, an important practice. You writing this book must have been a really good practice in sort of academic humility and in awareness of kind of your standard citizen, your standard voter, what they care about, what they know about, how to get them to care about things that they may not know about. It's probably important right here at the top, before we get into the book itself, to ask you point blank. Usually I would ask this off air, but I think it's kind of important maybe to just ask on air, given the context, the zeitgeist that we're in right now here in the United States, but of course globally as well. How much is the sort of the scientific, the social, also political for you? And how comfortable are you talking about these topics in that lens or in that context? Because we are a voting public and we do have to make decisions about these things as a community.
My position is that all science is political, which among historians and among humanities scholars, that's not a controversial statement, but it is a controversial statement among scientists, because that what that reads to a lot of scientists, what that sounds like is saying there's something wrong with your methods, or you can't be trusted to be a objective interpreter of your data, right?
Like, I'm impartial, therefore I'm apolitical, which is like,
Right.
those are two different things.
Those are two different things, and I think this moment is really it's a moment of reckoning for scientists that felt that their work was outside of the realm of politics. I think the idea that science is political is being weaponized right now, and that and what I mean by political, and so I one of the kind of main arguments in Wild by Design is that ecological restoration work is political, that it's not just scientific and technical, but it's also political. So I guess I should back up a little bit and define restoration. So
Yeah, yeah, let's do that a little bit. Let's contextualize these big topics from the book. Okay, so first of all, what is ecology? And second, what is restoration work?
ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and between organisms and their environments. So how a bird species might impact a tree species by consuming its seeds, by moving around its seeds in the landscape, and then also how the bird and the tree species might be impacting the soil and soil stability because of how tree distribution is changing on the landscape. And so ecology is a discipline, a relatively new scientific discipline. It kind of emerged from zoology and botany in the early 20th century, and I'm interested in that kind of history of the field coming together as its own thing, that where scientists said, we're doing something that is fundamentally different from what people at the time in zoology and botany were doing. I mean, in part, just they were arguing that zoology and biology and botany need to be brought together, which is obvious. It seems really obvious to us today because we're all familiar with ecology as a field and the idea of food chains and the idea of ecosystems, right? But these ideas didn't exist in that form in the early 20th century. So these scientists came together to create the British Ecological Society, the Ecological Society of America, these organizations in the early 20th century. And ecological restoration is the kind of efforts that people take, that scientists take, and that volunteers take to try and bring back species and ecosystems to a particular place after they've been damaged or destroyed. And so in Wild by Design, I define restoration as an attempt to design nature by collaborating with non-human species. So as humans, trying to work with other species to design a place. And I think that sounds very abstract, but we're all, something that's been was fun about writing this book and talking about this book is that most everyone's familiar with restoration and what restoration looks like and what their and restoration projects once you point it out to them. I think we don't really realize how many restoration projects are happening, both within the United States and in other countries. And this work is being done pretty much in every town, everywhere. People don't quite realize it until you point out, like, hey, have you ever, does your town have a native plant society? Or have you noticed that there's more bald eagles today than there was when you were younger? Right? There's a lot of this work flies under the radar and is hidden. And so one of the projects of the book is just to point out, like, hey, restoration is something that's happening at a really large scale. So we should be thinking about its politics. And it's something that's been done for a century now, largely by volunteers and later by scientists. And so if you think about breeding endangered species to try and put them back in the environment, that's restoration. If you think about trying to plant native plant species or remove non-native species, that's restoration. Removing I'm based in the northeastern US, although this is also a really big deal in the western US too. Removing dams in order to restore the ability of migrating fish to go upstream and to restore hydrological connectivity. That's restoration. Prescribed burns, so intentionally burning forests so that species that are adapted to fire can regenerate. That's restoration. So there's lots of different practices that are really, really different, and they all count as restoration. And the way I got into this project really is, like, the story behind it is I was working in this wetlands ecology lab, and I was, doing science that I was hoping would inform wetlands restoration at the state level. I was in New York State at the time. I did my PhD at Cornell University. And the state land managers that I was working with, and the federal ones who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they were using helicopters to spray herbicide onto wetlands. And I thought, this is weird. I didn't know environmentalists did this, because these were people who were really, they had dedicated their lives to protecting and restoring environments, and they were, dumping herbicides on wetlands. But it was the idea was that non-native plant species were harming the wetlands, that the only way to control them was to use these powerful herbicides like glyphosate. And so I got
Wetlands aren't Roundup ready. Like, that's
not
going to work.
No, it doesn't really work either. These are really, these are species that are able to really withstand a lot of
oh, great. So the invasive species are withstanding it, but the native species are dying at the hands. So that's good. That's the opposite of what they're trying to do.
And so it seemed like, oh, wow, this is a really blunt tool for trying to accomplish. And so that got me interested in, like, wait, why do so many people care about native species? And why do people think non-native species are such a big deal? The experiments I was doing at the time were showing that I was looking at how closely related native and non-native species So, like native Phragmites australis americanus and a congener Phragmites australis, which is from Eurasia and has been introduced across North America. They're incredibly closely related, different populations, really, of the same meta species. And I was using those sorts of pairs to compare closely related native and non-native species to see how they impacted amphibian communities, and to see if there, was a difference that could be, if we could see a signal of whether something was native or non-native. And I was finding that, as some other people have found too, that there wasn't a signal of a plant being native or non-native. That there's more kind of difference in effects and more evolutionary difference between native species than there was between closely related native and non-native species. So that got me, I think, down the rabbit hole of thinking about the history of the science of ecology, and also the history of the politics of ecology and environmental management. How did we end up at this place where we're kind of unthinkingly dumping herbicides in wetlands in order to try and help species? And it spiraled out from there to these broader questions of, almost all restoration projects, they involve caring for species. I start the book with the example of a man who lived with a whooping crane for 3 years. One whooping crane and one man lived together to try, and cranes are really social organisms, and so they don't into the right condition to mate unless they see these kind of very elaborate ritualistic dances, and unless they have a relationship with another crane. There weren't enough cranes in the captive breeding program for whooping cranes in the 1970s and 80s, so people had to pretend to be cranes in order to try and convince cranes to shift into a reproductive state and to lay eggs. And so um, it's just this incredible example of the dedication of science. In this case, it was a scientist, but also volunteers did this work, where you're really developing a relationship with an individual animal, and you're dedicating your whole life to trying to make sure that this species survives. So restoration work can involve these really intense, really intimate relationships between people and other species. And you obviously get to know really well how another species behaves, and how another individual, like that particular crane was named Tex, right? Like what Tex liked and disliked. And so restoration involves that sort of work, but restoration also involves a whole lot of killing. And we can think about spraying herbicide from helicopters, or another example I talk about in the book is paid snipers that also from helicopters shoot non-native goats in the Galapagos. And there's a lot of islands where there's these big predator eradication programs in the name of restoration, in the name of trying to get that particular place to a state that people want, but also one where the other organisms get to make some decisions for themselves, if that makes sense. And I think that's what's so weird about restoration too, is that it's different than gardening. It's, if we think about, so in environmental management, there's kind of two extremes. There's the kind of preservation movement, which began with John Muir and others, then kind of setting aside large pieces of land from human use and creating protected areas that were taken kind of out of capitalist production. Although the movement, so that we say that the movement kind of began in the 1870s with the first national parks, but it didn't really take off until the 1960s and 1970s, where you get an explosion of protected areas, so that today there's something like 17% of the world's land surface that is protected under some form of legal protection. And so that's the kind of hands-off approach, the idea that like the way that we can save other species is to retreat, basically. And then, and that's how I've always found that worrisome, because that kind of paints the world as two types of protected, cherished places, and then sacrifice areas, and what happens to the other 80% of the world where we all live. And so that's never seemed like a particularly sustainable way of thinking about living with other species to me. The other end of the spectrum is gardening, is like, or designer ecosystems, right? Like people totally deciding every single blade of grass that lives in an area.
Right. Like, or like terraforming an entire area or something. Yeah.
And I'm interested in restoration sits in between these two things, because restorationists are not trying to control everything. They're horrified when you call them gardeners, even though they are making these really drastic decisions about what species live and what species die in a landscape. But they're definitely not hands-off people. They're hands-on people that are trying to actively do something.
That's an important point, this idea of, I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and I had it too until I actually had the opportunity several years ago to travel to Southern Africa and speak at a conference. I was speaking about science communicating, difficult scientific topics to audiences that are coming from a different perspective. But the conference itself was actually about hunting, and hunting, like ecological hunting, conservation hunting in Southern Africa. And it was fascinating to have my eyes opened to this. Now I feel like I have a much deeper reverence for the fact that, like, all of these things are decisions. Like, everything is an active process. Even being hands off is usually very active. Like, we think about the quote wilds, right? Like, we think about like the savannah in Africa. Like, ooh, that's where it's really wild. And it's like, every apex predator there has a name. They are following them very closely. Anytime that you go to a reserve, there is very good understanding of the dynamics of a lot of these larger creatures. When I think about the concept of wild, even that construct is a really fascinating question. Like, it's in the title of your book, but but the way you contextualize it, right? The way you situate it, it's wild by design. Like, what does wild even mean? And can we even grapple with the concept of wild without the human kind of situated within that conversation?
Yeah, so I argue in the book, this is really what one of the questions that so interests me about environmental management. And with this book, I'm thinking about species management and how we live with other species, other plants and animals mostly. I don't touch. I don't really consider bacteria, even though and other microorganisms, even though we're also obviously making decisions about how we live with those species as well. But the macro fauna and flora, kind of thinking about how we choose to live with them. So there's infighting among different groups of people who consider themselves to be environmentalists, just like with conservation hunting, where there's environmentalists that are the kind of more hands-off, in the preservationist camp, and say, anything that people do destroys the wildness of a place. Those people define wildness as the absence of people, and that's in in the United States, the Wilderness Act, thinks about creating places that appear as if there's no trace of human presence.
But that doesn't make any sense because we live in a system.
And yeah, we live in a system now with climate change and with
Yeah.
globally distributed persistent pollutants. So there's that.
Right.
There's that
So yeah,
challenge.
even if there's no like community with concrete and citrus trees, like in the middle of the national park, like people living in houses, there's still, like you said, there's still warming effects. There's still microplastics in that national park. There's still pollutants in the air. We can't. There's nothing on this planet. Like, there's plastic in the Mariana Trench. Like, there's nothing on this planet that human activity hasn't touched.
Yeah, and I think too, So that's been one of the main challenges to this idea of wildness as peopleless, right? So the idea that like there's, and as you said before, the decision to do nothing and to not, try and manage a landscape is still a decision, because then it becomes, if climate change is happening everywhere, and so by not managing what species live in a national park, for example, then you're choosing to not help those species adapt to climate change.
True, and what you often get is just, like, a whole bunch of rats or, like, big algal blooms or, you get this runaway effect of the previous problem. And also,
So
I think
there's
there's
that.
one wha
Yeah, there's that critique that there's, so basically there's no going, with human change is now so pervasive that there's no such thing as a wild place if wild means unpeopled. But there's also the really important uh, historical and ethical argument that there never was such a thing as
Yes!
peopleless places, that this is a settler, specifically a settler colonial myth.
Yes,
The
and that
idea,
and
yeah,
it's also colonial perspective that the peopling of the planet is what did this, and it's like, yes, that's true, but we're talking about post-industrial, like, Western perspectives on what it means for people to have impact, because
right. And
there
you
have
think of
always
some of
been indigenous people in these places.
right. And if you think of some of the most iconic, what preservationists point to as the most iconic wilderness areas, the Amazon forest has historical ecologists and anthropologists and indigenous communities have proven that uncontrovertible evidence that people have dramatically altered the ecosystems in the Amazon for millennia. So there's that, and then if you think about like Yellowstone National Park, in that case it was the U.S. military that forcibly removed Crow, Blackfeet, Shoshone, Nez Perce communities that lived in Yellowstone in order to create the illusion of a peopleless place.
Right. When the people were doing fine there. And that's an interesting question too. Or maybe they weren't doing fine. I mean, that's the important question then becomes restoration or even intervention. Is it a moral valence? Like, is it a good versus bad? Is it how do we define if a decision is the right decision or it's in the right direction versus a wrong or bad decision?
And this is where I get to the kind of where I landed on in Wild by Design, that these are all political decisions. We would do well to recognize them as such, and that rather than that being a threat to the science of restoration ecology, which is its own, science that makes recommendations about what, species should be in a particular place, that restoration ecologists should realize that this realization will enfranchise more people and get more people kind of involved in the work of restoration, because we're in a place where, so the UN has declared this to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. There's a lot of private corporation funding going into restoration right now, especially if we think about forest based carbon offsetting and reforestation projects, just billions of dollars being thrown at restoration right now. And a lot, not so much. The United States is not going to be a leader on this, but in the European Union, they passed a restoration law last year that requires member states to do restoration. I think on 20% of their land and waters by 2030, and so this work is all being done and it's really being scaled up, but it's really going in. There need to be more resources put toward it, basically, because this is physical labor being conducted right now largely by volunteers. If you think about um, local wildlife organizations, if you think about local land trusts, local native plant societies, right? Like these are the people who kind of in their spare time on the weekend are doing a lot of this work. And so I think there's a real kind of opportunity. I think we're in a period in the United States where we can't expect to see any leadership at the federal, I'm going to put that lightly. We can't expect to see leadership at the federal level, but that leaves an opportunity at the state level and the local level to invest resources in restoration. And it's interesting to have worked on a topic that actually is so bipartisan. And I think that's something for people to think about with restoration too. I'm working right now on the kind of history of. I'm writing a book on the history of biocides, and that's a much more the use of herbicides and pesticide and insecticides and fungicides that are derived from petrochemicals, right? Like a much more polarizing topic, one that's much more partisan. But most everyone appreciates that there's some species that are making a recovery from where they were at in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And people want to be in healthy environments surrounded by interesting species. And so it's an interestingly well.
Or at least historically, they have, that that's such an I mean, going back to this idea that which is so astute, that fundamentally this is as scientists, we are engaging in political action. I think it's important to really underline the fact that while maybe when we talk about ecological restoration, there is already an intentionality there and it's already somewhat goal oriented or it's already somewhat decided the what, but the how is, like you talked about, there's like the far one side of the spectrum and the other side of the spectrum is how are we going to, approach this question, but that the question exists and that it matters was sort of somewhat settled. I think if we broaden that out even to the idea of like stewardship of the planet or where do we put our resources or how do we, you know, whether we want to be extractive or we want to be protective, these are all fundamental political questions, right? Like, what purpose do we want, let's say, these government agents, the EPA, for example, what purpose do we want the EPA to serve? And I think that most scientists, I have friends at the EPA who are shitting bricks right now. And most scientists were caught with their pants down because they just sort of assumed that this was apolitical. And if they just kind of don't have a political perspective and they just keep their head down and keep doing their job, that from a bipartisan perspective, everybody wants, the environment protected, right? We want clean water. We don't want Superfund sites. We want them cleaned up. The problem with not seeing this as fundamentally political or staying out of the political game altogether is that now there are all these people who are the very people who should be advocating for this, who some of them have been, but many of them have assumed they didn't need to advocate
Right.
for it.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that also there's the kind of problem of a generational loss of knowledge where I teach undergraduates and this is where I think, that understanding environmental history is so important because when I'm teaching about the history of pollution regulation, I show photographs of what smog looked like in LA in the 60s, and people gasp, right? Like we
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah, they don't remember what it's so clean here. Because people are like, oh, LA is so dirty. And it's like, look back.
We don't want to live in a country where the US EPA stops fulfilling its congressional mandate. I mean,
But that's about to happen. Like, let's be clear. They're about to fire every scientist. Like, that was the most recent announcement. By the time this airs, I don't know what's going to have happened. But the most recent leak is no more scientific activity at the EPA. No more basic research. What?
And again, I think, it's
Yeah, I know.
the kind of the
The
effects
deep
of that
sigh.
decision are going to be so immediately. I think the catastrophe is it's going to be so immediately apparent, in terms of air and water quality, but it's also going to be an issue because you're talking about increasing the amount of mercury and PFAS and other, really persistent pollutants into the environment, and then it's going to be, centuries that people are dealing with that.
Because we're not just talking about rolling back protections, we're also talking about accelerating extractive practices and very toxic practices. And I think fundamentally, I'm curious from you, how much of the sort of science meets the political, and how much of that, I guess, I don't want to say antagonism, but talking past each other very often comes down to the fact that ecological restoration as a practice, as a philosophy, as a scientific endeavor, all of the above, requires long foresight. And so much of the political machine requires, let's make a decision right now for tomorrow. And we're not even thinking about beyond the next 4 years because I won't be in office then.
Yeah, no. And so I've actually, not in the book, but elsewhere, written about exactly this because the timescales of restoration are totally mismatched to political timescales. Even if you look at, some of the more ambitious restoration legislation, like in the EU, you're talking like the targets of, let's restore 20% of land in the next, what is it now, 5 years, right? It's just totally, if you're talking about, if you're talking about restoring a tree and a tree species which takes 100 to 300 years to reach maturity, then you can't restore that species in a political time frame. And what that's doing, interestingly, but maybe maybe catastrophically, is it's causing restoration ecologists and land managers and scientists to choose species that are fast growing and fast to mature. Because then they're also under pressure to prove that a project is done and to prove success before the next funding cycle. So there's
so
that.
We're not talking about old growth forests here. We're not talking about
Right, and that's why you're ending up with monoculture tree plantations for carbon offsetting projects because those projects are working on like a 5 year, 2 to 5 year time scale, and so there's a real mismatch.
So you're gardening, like we go back to we're gardening at this point, which is difficult.
Good news is that restorationists have been, thinking about this for decades, and that even in the the first kind of projects in the 19 teens and 1920s, restorationists really were thinking about how to set places on a trajectory so that they could be kind of healing rather than being further harmed. I think one, and it's interesting too, so we're now seeing restoration be legislated in some countries, some Central American countries and some European countries. In the United States, as I talk about in Wild by Design, restoration really emerged through the regulatory state, and it's in a very weird way. It's not actually really regulated by any particular agent. That we don't have a restoration service or Department of Restoration in the United States.
Right. We have like the Interior and Land Management and EPA and but they all do different things.
They all do it a little bit differently. It's this real kind of patchwork. So I don't really know how to make a prediction for what that looks like under the Trump administration and into the future, because on one hand, it's so dispersed and so kind of hidden in the different agencies. If agencies are completely dismantled, then restoration at the federal level goes away too. But if it's just that budgets are cut and personnel is cut, it's going to be, there's this way in which restoration's already operating with a very small budget and with a lot of volunteer hours and at a state level and local level too. And so the kind of really ambitious overarching frameworks of the Biden administration are not going to happen, and they're not going to be achievable. But I don't know if it's really going to impact restoration practice that much in the United States. And I think what's also interesting, so we haven't talked about this in this conversation, but there's restoration. I said that restoration is really bipartisan and kind of not controversial, but I'll take that back because it's actually quite controversial among some environmentalists who argue that it opens up an argument for extraction. That if you can say that if a company or the federal government can say, well, we'll just mine on this land for 20 years and don't worry, we'll restore it after. Right? That kind of creates an open
Right.
door, a license to pollute. Right? If scientists are saying it's possible to
Of
restore
course. Yeah.
species and restore places, then why not just temporarily damage
Yeah,
them
it's a
and then
bit
fix them again?
dangerous. Right. Yeah. No, we definitely have to be careful about that.
And that's where I think, in trying to think about and trying to define restoration, I was thinking a lot about the humility angle and the idea that restorationists have approached their practice as a collaboration with other species. And so it's not a collaborative position to say, like, okay, we'll trash this place for the next 20 years and then collaborate, right? Like there needs to be a balancing of human needs and the needs of other species.
Right, because we're here. We're not going anywhere. I to the point that you made, I think, like a point before, I'm curious about your take, and I always do this on the podcast. I'm like formulating my question as I'm thinking deeply about it, so it may come out a bit circumlocuted. But when we think about systems, and I'm trying to think of an analogy, like an analogous example. The only one I can kind of come up with right now in my morning brain is like the healthcare system. And you have approaches to healthcare in a lot of developed nations where there's like a national health service, but then there might be like some separate, like private, options for some individuals. And then you have like this very scattershot system in the US where there actually is nationalization of like insurance providers. But beyond that, we have different providers approaching different things. And public health is very like, we think we have some goals, but let's just deal with it at the local level. When I think about ecology as a whole, or like the planet as a whole, is this like large, very stochastic system. And then I think about restoration efforts today, they feel to me more scattershot,
Yes.
right? Like there are places where there are goals, I suppose, and there are sort of like governing bodies, but even globally, we're not really working together. And the hope is just like, okay, we do what we can over here, you do what you can over there. Let's hope for the best. Like, is that I know it takes all types. And yes, we should be acting locally and thinking globally, or whatever the 1990s logo said or slogan said. But at the same time, is this scattershot approach, is it a net positive, do you think? Is it a net negative? Are we screwing ourselves?
I think it's a net positive in
Okay.
terms of ecological restoration. And here's my argument. So, first off, ecological restoration by necessity just looks really different in different places because those different places have different histories and because they have different ecosystems.
Such an important point. Like, just sorry, too quick to break in, but when I was in Africa, that was one of the big takeaways, was that, like, in the West, we cannot be mandating trophy hunting in Namibia. We are like, white guilt about things we do not understand does not translate there.
Yeah.
And so often they were like, we are hamstrung by activists in America, and it screws up our ability to manage our own land. So I remember that being like a kind of wake up moment for me. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I think that restoration has to be driven by local knowledge and local priorities and local context, and that there's actually a danger with these really consolidated. We're seeing a move toward more consolidated restoration projects with carbon offsetting, with kind of the way that philanthropic and corporate funding is going toward restoration. And I think the reason that's so threatening is because with in most places now, with the way that property ownership works, the way to make decisions on a piece of land is to own that piece of land. And so it's actually creating an incentive for carbon offsetting companies, for giant NGOs to land grab and to, either purchase or seize land from local communities, take it out of community management, and then maybe they're doing, good work on it for a couple of years, but what's going to happen long term is just it's consolidating land ownership, and I don't think that's good. So I don't I don't want to see a world where there's more coordination of restoration practices. I do want to see a world where there's more coordination to stop the devastation of ecosystems and to and to slow down extractive practices. So I do think there needs to be coordination at a global scale in terms of reducing harm.
Right, almost like a global regulation, but not global strategy.
Yeah. And I think that needs to that restoration without being paired with uh, strategies and efforts to reduce harm makes no sense. Because that is just a band-aid that is, kind of doing nothing to shift the baseline or to improve environments. And I think the other place where I do think there's a need for global coordination is with kind of knowledge sharing, and the Society for Ecological Restoration is already doing a lot of that work, where it's a way for people to share success stories. And again, a particular technique might not work in the same two places because places are so unique and so different. But I think getting the stories out there of success, and people who are working on restoration talking to people in other parts of the world about what they're doing, I think that is the sort of coordination that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah. I'm like, what can I add to that? I don't think there is much. I think that that is a really important summary of where we have to go. This idea, I think about as a psychologist, right? Like the fundamental, our ethics code is long and complex, but everything comes back to inducing or protecting beneficence and reducing or avoiding maleficence. It's just I have to make sure that every decision I make is in service to not harming my patients and to ensuring that I'm doing as much as I can to help and protect them. And there are times there are times ethically when we have to call up the ethics board and say, okay, is this decision actually harmful or beneficial? Because there are different perspectives on that. And so I guess that is a curiosity for me. This idea of reducing harm, or this idea of improving ecologic, however you want to define it, diversity, resilience, all these different things. There must be times, though, where even scientists disagree on the decision-making process. Like, wait, is this good for us or is this bad for us? Or does this have downstream consequences that are like, what's the ROI? Are these downstream consequences worse than the immediate benefits? So, what happens when these different institutions or these even different individual shareholders, I guess, disagree about reducing harm?
And that does happen all the time. If you think about, environmentalists being pitted against each other for, say, in the Northeast United States, we have incredibly high numbers of white-tailed deer, um, because hunting was well, because large predators were extirpated, largely by the federal government, and then which I talk about in the book, and then also because hunting was heavily was suppressed for decades, and so we have a zillion white-tailed deer, and they're destroying forest understories, and so there's a whole new generation of forest that's not going to be able to regenerate because of this. So you have environmentalists that are like, we have to, in order to protect and restore forests, like we have to kill a lot of deer, and we have to kill deer in suburban areas, and like children are going to see deer being killed. And then you have environmentalists that say like it's not okay to kill a bunch of innocent deer, and that the animal, the animal welfare perspective is like, if we care about the environment, why would we be killing wild animals? And so that's like one of the clearest examples of restoration being pitted against each other.
Yeah, and that example is on steroids, recently in Botswana, where there was an all-out ban on elephant hunting, and then the elephants in that area, and yes, these are endangered creatures, but even something like an endangered animal is not, their numbers are not evenly dispersed. And so you saw this explosion of elephants destroying the forests in Bots, and they had to go, "Okay, sorry, we have to relift the ban."
And I think with the analogy of the psychology ethics board, right? So then how do
Mhm.
you weigh the harm to the forests against the harm of the to the deer? And then to complicate it even further, and I'm going to talk outside of my wheelhouse here.
No, please do, please do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I imagine that ethics boards are thinking in part, kind of using their human intuition of what constitutes harm. But then, there's the added complication with restoration of who gets to speak for other species. Like,
Right, they can't speak for
how does
themselves.
the white-tailed deer actually think about harm, or the yellow-bellied sapsucker? And again, this kind of question divides animal studies scholars and animal behaviorists and other kind of disciplines that think about the worlds of animals. I am a person who maintains that animals do experience harm, and but that all we can do is try and guess at what the kind of interests of other species might be. But that the fact that
Absolutely.
ultimately we can't have a conversation with those species is not an excuse to therefore just throw up our hands and say that it doesn't matter, or that it's not worth trying to imagine what it would be like to be other species.
I agree, and I think the analogy again, it's so interesting going back to the ethics board. The analogy I would use are these cases where someone is deemed not to have capacity. Like I've seen struggles in the very hospital where I worked, where let's say somebody with advanced dementia also has cancer, and then the question is, can they be administered chemotherapy? Is the ROI important? Like, is the pain that they're going to undergo due to the chemo worth the extended life when this person already has advanced dementia and cannot make that decision for themselves? Or I see it with medical aid in dying quite often. Somebody is dying from their disease, and then there's a question on the ethics board of, does this person have capacity to make the very decision that they want to hasten their own death? And I think these are very similar questions in some ways, where our own moral struggles can sort of cloud or just complicate the question of what's best for not just the individual, but also for the system. And because now we're getting to like trolley problems, and we're getting to these very complex ethical debates. Is what's best for the whole, or is it worth it for these individuals to suffer, and vice versa? How do we, I guess, induce beneficence at the greatest how do we maximize beneficence? And that's a really tough question, and it's one that you grapple with really beautifully, with a lot of beautiful stories. I know we didn't get into a lot of individual stories. It's not always how I roll on the podcast, because I feel like that's the point of the book, right? Like I want to talk about these overarching questions and sort of the theory and the philosophy and the ethics behind these overarching questions, because I think the stories that you tell in the book, they really help illustrate and bring these points home. So I've got to ask, because I've already kept you longer than I already promised I would. Are there any big takeaways that we haven't discussed? Like, obviously, we're living in a time that it's difficult to find hope. We know that the pressures, the political pressures right now, are overwhelming. All of us kind of are in this existential place. Um, A, how do you maintain hope? And B, are there any big kind of overarching themes here that you want to leave us with that might help us breathe a little easier today?
Yeah, I I think of ecological restoration as a hopeful practice and a hopeful science. And it's one that inherently is about taking action. And I think we're in a moment right now where a lot of people are asking, how can I take action? And what can I do? And restoration is something that an individual can do. I think it needs to go, however, and the kind of other big takeaway from the book is that restoration cannot be only an individual practice or only done on private land, right? This is something that is needed at a global scale and in every type of place, and not just in people's backyards or in national parks, but also in cities, in agricultural places. And it's a kind of Wild by Design is really a call for people to think about how we can do better at living with other species, and thinking about everywhere as a place that's worth stewarding and loving and cherishing.
Yeah. Well put. Everybody, the book is Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, now available in a lighter and softer, more portable format by Dr. Laura J. Martin. Laura, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.